Привет, moi druzy. Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gerdes. I'm a professor who's been tracking what's been going on in Ukraine, and I want to welcome you today. Today, we have a lot of ground to cover, but I'm going to connect a lot of different dots for you. These are all today's articles in the news, but I've selected out like ones that are just like, here's a battle map, or here's why this guy was poisoned, or whatever. But I've selected those that will help you kind of get a framework for what's going on in Ukraine. We're going to talk about the Russian defensive lines, not just what's coming with the offensive, but where the defensive lines are. We'll talk about their information campaign, and this is absolutely fascinating. We'll ask ourselves whether Prigozhin is really a player or a puppet, or what's going on with him. We'll look at how outmatched Russia is economically. We look at Russia compared to Ukraine and we think, what's going on? But if we look at Russia compared to NATO, what does that look like? And then we'll look at the U.S. State Department telling U.S. citizens to leave Russia. We'll talk about Russians' plans for Moldova. We'll talk about why so many tanks are being destroyed in Vuhledar. And we'll then conclude with some fun with Russian state media and talk about what happened 1 year ago today. Thanks for joining me. Now we're going to begin with this. This is Jens Stoltenberg. He's the Secretary General of NATO. He said the reality is that we are already seeing the start of the Russian offensive. So the Russian offensive was kind of weird. We were thinking it was going to be this big massing going for one particular place, but they really seem to just filling up defensive lines, like not trying to lose anything. Now that could be, somebody left in a comment, and that could be that, they're just trying to trick them. But remember, there are also satellites watching wherever mass formations might be massing. So I'm not sure whether it's a trick or whether they just have weird strategy that I don't understand. Putin is accepting a very high rate of casualties. What Russia lacks in quality, says Stoltenberg, they try to compensate for in quantity, he says, which highlights how urgent it is for the West to supply Ukraine with more weapons. And that's right, they just keep throwing bodies at the Ukrainian defenders, and that seems to be their best strategy so far. Okay, let's turn our attention to the British Ministry of Defense intelligence update. Russia has established a defensive fortifications between the towns of Valisvikva and Orkiv. I can't pronounce these. I'm so sorry. Zaporizhia Oblast. So they're going beyond those 3 or 4 hotspots, and then they're trying to make sure that the Ukrainians can't just cut right down the center of Zaporizhia and kill that land bridge. Russia remains concerned about guarding the extremities of its extended front line. This is demonstrated by the continued construction of defensive fortifications in Zaporizhia and Luhansk. A major Ukrainian breakthrough in Zaporizhia would seriously challenge the viability of Russia's land bridge, linking Russia's Rostov region and Crimea. And they're really concerned about that. Deciding which of these threats to prioritize countering is likely one of the central dilemmas for Russian operational planners. Like, okay, well, where do we go? How do we, what's our best advantage? What do they want to do? And they have to be thinking through all these things. Now, while they're thinking through things militarily, they're also thinking through things in terms of the information space. The ISW was absolutely awesome today. Well, this was actually yesterday's ISW as I'm reading this now. Russia has partially regained the ability to conduct successful information campaigns in support of strategic objectives. So the way that Russia fights war, they're very concerned about the informational space, right? And the Gerasimov doctrine is 4-to-1 other non-kinetic to kinetic, so information or humanitarian crises or whatever else they can throw at them. Russia's hybrid warfare theory has long called for the integration of information campaigns and military operations, with information operations sometimes taking precedence over kinetic activity. Most notably, those that supported the Minsk II Accords, in which Germany and France accepted Russia as a mediator. Did you know that? I didn't even realize that Russia was accepted as a mediator rather than a belligerent in Ukraine. How freaking bizarre is that Russia, who's fighting in Ukraine, not officially, but the little green men, is actually brought to the table to help mediate it so that Russia could get what they wanted. The Biden administration conducted a remarkable, successful counter-information campaign in the months leading up to the February 22 full-scale invasion. However, disrupting multiple Russian information campaigns intended to induce Ukrainian surrender, separate Ukraine from the West, and create a favorable conditions for reinvasion. That's right. They were pre-bunking rather than debunking. They were saying, look, we know that Russia's about to do this. Look, we can see that Russia's massed on the border here. Look, we're telling you that Russia's about to do these things. And then Russia was beside themselves trying to debunk our pre-bunking. And you'll see some of this before we're done today. Russia's information campaigns have supported a continuous strategic objective of deterring or slowing the West's provision of material support to Ukraine. And they've done that well. They have deterred the West for a long, long time. A lot of people have died because they've been successful at this. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has likely bought into his own pre-invasion narrative. That's right. He bought his own press. And that's the amazing thing about this. Like, he believed his own lies, that the West would not support Ukraine, but would instead seek to maintain good relations with Russia, fueling his hopes for a speedy victory in Ukraine. However, Putin soon realized that the war would protract, that is, it would take more time. So Putin thereupon began to focus on feeding the arguments Western leaders were making to themselves about the dangers of providing Ukraine with too much material, of certain kinds of material, otherwise the Russians might nuke them. These Russian information campaigns have been continuous in their pursuit of common aim of inhibiting Western support of Ukraine. So the Russians have been doing this, they've been doing this purposefully, and they've been doing this continuously. Russia uses the narrative that Ukraine is incapable of defeating Russia because of its inherent power disparities. Well, we're going to talk about those power disparities in some degree here in just a moment. Russia's information campaigns earlier in the invasion relied on amplifying the assumption that Russia possesses the second largest military in the world with advanced military capabilities. Well, it turns out they're not that advanced. They do have nukes, but the regular conventional fighting forces are just not that great. Okay, this is aimed to mislead the West and Ukraine into believing that any transfers of military equipment would be irrelevant because Ukraine would not be able to withstand the rapidly unfolding offensive. The Russians have not shown the dynamic targeting capabilities needed to strike Western materiel. Instead, they have resorted to wasting their precision weapons on striking fixed civilian energy infrastructure throughout Ukraine. A little bit further, Russia intensified narratives about the risk of nuclear escalation in September to November of 2022 to re-establish deterrence and dissuade the West from providing Ukraine the material. Why? Because if they could just hold out long enough, they could buy themselves some time. The nuclear information operation in the fall of 2022, however, was likely specifically intended to deter the West from immediately reinforcing Ukraine's sweeping counteroffensives, right? And they did that well. They've won on that ground at that point in time. It is now clear that the Russian information campaign centering on peaceful negotiations intensified in December 2022 was aimed, among other things, at delaying the provision of Western tanks. And they've done that. The tanks are still barely rolling in, and they're not going to be completely rolling in until late spring, maybe into the summer. And the ISW goes on a little bit more. The West should consider that Russia's discussions of negotiations may not be about negotiations or considerations for peace at all, but may rather be information campaigns specifically targeted at getting Russia through windows of opportunity or vulnerability on the battlefield. That is, to delay so that Russia has time to regroup, train their mobilized soldiers, and be able to counterattack. All these information campaigns will support the overarching Kremlin strategic aims of splitting the West from Ukraine. Now, there are some people that provide the battle map, and they do that very well. I'm not one of those. I look at this kind of thing because this is really important to understanding the bigger picture of what's going on and why. Okay, let's turn our attention to another article. Prigozhin. Is Prigozhin a puppet, or is he really a player? So Prigozhin is the head of the notorious Wagner Group, a Kremlin-sanctioned boogeyman, or a real threat to the president? And when I say a player, like, he might be what comes after Putin. What if he is? Wouldn't that be amazing? Okay, let's look at this. Known as Putin's chef due to the president's patronage of his restaurants and catering firms, in 2014 he co-founded Wagner Group as along with a former Russian military personnel, and has since become a major player. When Prigozhin began recruiting soldiers in Russian prisons in the late summer of 2022, offering them pardon in exchange for 6 months service in Ukraine, under Russian law, they were kind of scratching their heads going, wait a minute, only the president can pardon convicted felons. So he got some kind of deal in order to do that. Prigozhin, however, has shown signs that he won't accept a purely subordinate role. He openly criticizes and challenges state officials, including top generals. And so he's been in a fight with Gerasimov and talking smack back and forth with Igor Girkin and others. Girkin's not a general; he's just a mill blogger. But he's been involved in some spats. It's been like watching the Kardashians, but in the military context in Ukraine and Russia. Prigozhin recently announced that he was no longer recruiting in prisons. This is a sign that the defense ministry may be trying to clip his wings. We don't know exactly. Even before last year's invasion of Ukraine, Wagner had a reputation for summary murders, rape, extreme violence. A dire recent example of this was the film Sledgehammer killing of a Wagner deserter from Ukraine. So they just killed him with a sledgehammer because they caught him after he deserted. Now, they said that they were going to do that. Here's another one. Today, another video of PMC Wagner fighter killed with sledgehammer appears on the internet. This is today. Look at the date, right? Okay, so that's how they are. They're not exactly great guys. Prigozhin was praised the killing, and Peskov stated that the murder was not the government's business. I mean, like, how cold can you be? Other private armies are also on the rise. So they have multiple private armies. Now, I only learned this from watching Anders Puck Nielsen, and if you have never seen this guy before, you need to watch his videos. He is absolutely brilliant on what's going on. He has some military background that I don't have, and yeah, they have private armies. And what happens with these private armies? Did you know that defense minister, not just Prigozhin having private armies, defense minister Sergei Shoigu has a private army? Wrap that around your head for a moment. The defense minister of Russia has his own private army, and he's in charge of both. It's not a conflict of interest. It's called Patriot, and it's been operating in Ukraine since 2014. Oligarch Timonchenko's private army, originally created to protect his company's gas fields, is also present in Ukraine. And there's Chechen leader Kadyrov's army as well. And so it's really bizarre. But Prigozhin is indeed sometimes touted to become a successor to Putin. And he's also a threat to Putin in that same way. Is he under Putin's control, or is he a threat? Now, a former KGB agent and Russian oligarch who have both maintained that Prigozhin is hyped as a boogeyman to be presented to Russian audiences who fantasize about regime change. Remember, I talked about this extensively yesterday. The Russian people will not rise up and dispose of Putin. I can tell you that emphatically. At least right now, the conditions are not such that they can even think through this. Go back and watch that yesterday if you haven't. So they're hyped up as a boogeyman to present Russia to Russian audiences who fantasize about regime change. The warning is clear. If Putin goes, things could be worse. So what is Prigozhin's role? Well, he's part helpful and part a threat and part used as a foil. So that's what Prigozhin is. And I'm not exactly sure how to even compare him to an American figure in the United States. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about the odds. Now, you know that Russia is a huge country. Ukraine is only about the size of Texas. You know that Russia has 3 times the population of Ukraine, and so it's not a fair fight in that sense. You know, now here, let's look at Ukrainian GDP versus Russian GDP. Ukraine's GDP was 155.5 billion US dollars in 2020. Russia's GDP was 1.48 trillion. So the GDP disparities are remarkable. Now, this was an article in Foreign Affairs that came out today. It was all about NATO and how the NATO alliance worked, but then there's this one paragraph that really jumped out to me. Putin's failure to recognize that states allied to balance threats and violating existing norms against conquest would be particularly alarming to the West was a major blunder. Like, he just didn't see that NATO would link arms together like they did. He appears to have assumed that either Kyiv would fall before NATO could act, or that its members would limit their response to verbal protests and sanctions. After all, what did they do with Georgia? Why didn't they act in 2014? He was wrong on both counts, and Russia now finds itself fighting an opponent backed by partners with a total GDP of more than 40 trillion compared to Russia's 1.8 trillion. So while it's not a fair fight when you look at Ukraine's GDP, like if you're just going to think about how can you actually fight the war, do you have the resources to do it? Ukraine's GDP to Russia's GDP, it's no contest. But when you look at NATO's GDP versus Russia's GDP. It's again no contest. Russia cannot possibly win this war. I mean, it's not going to happen. There's no, and Russia is constantly going out of its way to say we're fighting with NATO. Well, you're fighting against NATO weapons, but you're not fighting NATO, and the economics of it. It's just not going to work for you. Okay, one more thing about this before I move on to the next topic. Look at 40 trillion against Russia's 1.8 trillion. But Russia keeps trying to say we got to move away from this unipolar world to this bipolar world where the BRICS are counterbalancing. But even if you counterbalance with the BRICS, look at this. These are the BRIC countries. What you have highlighted here, you have Russia, China, India, South Africa, Brazil. Now, if you counterbalance with the BRICS, you still only have 24 trillion as GDP, right? 24 as opposed to 40. You're still not going to get there. So Zelensky's sanctions against Russia must include nuclear industry and must become part of the global sanctions. I think he's right. I don't know why we haven't done that sooner, but they're working on that. Now, this was really fascinating. I saw this article, Nikkei Asia. U.S. has told citizens to leave Russia immediately due to the war in Ukraine and the risk of arbitrary arrest or harassment by Russian law enforcement. So then I looked it up again, and again, yep. This was in Reuters today. U.S. citizens residing or traveling in Russia should depart immediately, says the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Exercise increased caution due to the risk of wrongful detentions. Do not travel to Russia. Russian security services have arrested U.S. citizens on spurious charges, singled out U.S. citizens in Russia for detention and harassment, and denied them fair and transparent treatment. So, yeah, if the U.S. State Department is telling you to get out of Russia, something's not very kosher. Okay, let's turn our attention to Moldova. We talked about this a few days ago with Zelensky pointing out to the Moldovan powers that be that, look, we have evidence of Russia's plot against you. And then the Moldovan PM just stepped down. This is the Moldovan president. And she outlined Monday what she described as a plot by Moscow to use external saboteurs to overthrow her country's government. The plan for the next period involves actions with the involvement of diversionists with the military training, camouflaged in civilian clothes, who will undertake violent actions, attack some state buildings, even take hostages, she told reporters at the briefing. The purpose of these actions is to overthrow the constitutional order, to change the legitimate power from their government to an illegitimate one, which would put our country at the disposal of Russia in order to stop the European integration process. Now, this was supposed to be taking place after Ukraine was completely taken, but apparently it's still in the works in the minds of the Russian planners. So that's what's going on in Moldova. Shifting gears again, let's talk about what's happening in Vuhledar. So, new anti-tank tactic: lay a minefield, then scatter more mines from the air. Now, there was a Department of Defense official that said on a scale of 1 to 10, the Ukrainians are a 12. And there's something to that. Like, okay, so the Ukrainians have adopted a clever new method of laying mines. Ukrainian gunners wait until Russian troops clear a path through an old minefield, and then they toss fresh mines onto that same path as the Russians are crossing. The pattern is familiar. Armored vehicles roll in neat lines across fields and forests between Russian-occupied Pavlika and Vuhledar. Then the lead tank hits a mine and explodes. The rest of the column falls into disarray. Some vehicles try to go around the wrecked lead vehicle, only themselves to run into mines. And even retreat is dangerous. There might be mines behind the column too. That's what's going on. But the Russians just keep pushing people forward, material, tanks, whatever forward. This is how you get 30 Russian tanks captured in a single day. Okay, let's turn our attention now to some fun with Russian state media. This might be the best RT article I've ever read. Russian scientists claim that they've invented tranquilizing cheese. So the soothing effect is a combination of herbs, according to biotechnology. Why this is an important article in RT, I don't know, but I just find it humorous. Okay, let's look at a less than humorous one. U.S. training terrorists to target Russia, says Moscow. 60 militants at a base in Syria are being prepared for attacks on Russians. Who are they allegedly using? The U.S. military is actively recruiting militants from jihadist groups affiliated with Islamic State, IS, or ISIS, and Al-Qaeda to commit terrorist acts in Russia. Okay, I'll believe it when I see it. It's an RT, so I'm a little skeptical. I don't even know what to think about that. But I do know this. Somebody left a comment yesterday that I thought, why didn't I think of that? And it was this. Why don't you look at RT or Pravda or whatever from a year ago? You know, you do that section on what happened 1 year ago today. So let's look at 1 year ago today. Here's RT 1 year ago today. Let's see what absurd things that they will say.
Well, Russia has slammed what it brands as manufactured hysteria over Ukraine, claiming that alarmist speculation over an imminent invasion is ultimately giving Kiev a pretext to scupper the Minsk agreements.
Really? Alarmist? And it's giving Kiev a pretext for something? You're at the border with 100,000, 150,000 troops, and and you're saying that Kiev is the one that's the problem, being an alarmist.
Now, Australia has temporarily shut down its embassy in Kiev, relocating all operations to the west. That after a number of countries urged their citizens to leave. It's all amid media reports alleging Russia will attack in the coming days. Moscow continues to insist it has no designs on Ukraine. Breaking down the latest now.
So they lie, and they lie, and they lied even before they started doing anything worth lying about. They're still lying.
Our correspondent, here's RT's Saskia Taylor.
As the panic around Ukraine reaches fever pitch, the world's been laying bets on how it will all play out.
This is a very different situation and things could go crazy quickly.
So crazy and quickly, apparently, that people are being told to run while they can.
We encourage all American citizens who remain in Ukraine to depart immediately. We are in the window when an invasion could begin at any time, should Vladimir Putin decide to order it.
And he might be almost 15,000 kilometers away from Kiev, all the way over in Australia. But even from there, Blinken could feel the crazy coming.
An invasion could begin at any time.
But he's right. See, that's the thing. He's right, and she should be apologizing for this diatribe that she's putting out there. He's right.
During the Olympics, any American citizens who remain in Ukraine should leave now.
The media have also been keen to cash in on the hysteria, hyping up every juicy detail about the Russian invasion that's been imminent for months. After all, de-escalation just doesn't bring in the punters. But in all the...
Okay, so she's saying it like it's just somehow the Western media is causing this. Well, 150,000 troops on the Ukrainian border with some threats toward Ukraine. Take that away, take that out of the equation, and if they're saying it, they sound nuts. But this is not nuts.
Chaos. They just can't seem to agree. Let's take the when, for example. Now, Der Spiegel and Politico might have money on the 16th, but Bloomberg's put a little X on the calendar on the 15th. Others think the end of the Olympics, that 20th is more likely. My team's hoping it's on our day off. And then there's a whole group who say we might be in for a very long wait.
Okay, it turned out to be on the 24th, so they're not very far off.
Because it's pretty muddy, so not great for tanks. So maybe this imminent invasion will come next Christmas when the ground has frozen over again.
She's such a jerk.
It's almost as if they all got together and decided to pick a date each, to cover all the bases and just flood the news.
We can talk about the collusion of the authorities of Western countries and the media in order to escalate artificial tension around Ukraine by the massive and coordinated publication of false information and geopolitical interests, in particular, to distract attention from their own aggressive actions.
Sure, so it's Ukraine that's causing it. It's the West that's causing it. Really? This is what was being consumed 1 year ago today. Let's look at some CNN headlines. 1 year ago today. These are the latest from CNN. Ukraine allocates nearly $600 million to ensure flights across the country to continue. The American ambassador to the UN cancels a trip to Liberia to focus on Ukraine. It's that important. Zelensky is asking Biden for greater support and military financial support, officials say. Canadian armed forces are relocating some of their joint task force personnel out of Ukraine. And one more, Biden told Zelensky U.S. will respond swiftly and decisively to further aggression by Russia. That's where we were 1 year ago today. Was this helpful to you? Did this help you understand more of what's going on in Ukraine? If it did, I'd appreciate it if you'd give me a thumbs up, if you'd share a comment. You can buy me a cup of coffee if you want to support me. You can also support United 24 and other charities. Those links are below. If you want to read my book on Kindle Unlimited for free, I Need Ammunition, Not a Ride, about Zelensky, you can do that. Or you can purchase, if you want to support Ukraine, because all the proceeds from this will go to Ukrainian humanitarian relief, a complete collection of Vladimir Putin's Truth About Ukraine, which is a gag gift. It's blank. All right. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.